while I get a table and my things ready, I want you to speak to the people around you on this question. So this is the question you need to answer to the people you're with. What is the greatest thing you have ever done for God? Right. I'm looking forward to some brilliant doings that people can share. So we bring it back together. I would like you to dob in the person that was talking to you and tell me some of the things that you've heard, some of the great things people have done for God. Be obedient. That's a good political answer. I like that. Anyone else? Okay, so Thomas and family. Thomas's family moved to the UK. You did that for God. It's good. Gave up a career. Good. Anyone else? Good. Good. So Beth started a Christian Union at school. That's a pretty good thing to do for God. Anyone else? Just shout it out. Gave up his job for God. There's a theme, isn't there, of things that we do for God. This wasn't particularly an intended theme, but generally the biggest thing we can do for God is a nothing, right? Is an absence of thing. It's a putting God before ourselves. It's a giving something up in order for God to fill the gap. And the tenuous link to then where we are today is that as the story unfolds this morning, you'll find that it isn't possible to do God's work for him without his leading. So the best thing we can do for God is to be obedient. And really, the best thing about that is that it's not something we do for God. Instead, it's us standing to the side and allowing him to do the work for us. So this morning, we are looking at a character from the Old Testament. So as you probably remember, we're taking a bit of time to look at often what are called heroes of faith. And we've drawn some characters from Hebrews chapter 11. Not all of them, but there are a lot of Old Testament characters in there who show faith in a particular way. But the entire theme of that chapter, and in fact the whole book of Hebrews, that whole letter written, is about how the key attributes of the person mentioned are irrelevant. So there are some real big hitters in there. There's Noah and his boat. There's Abraham and his many, many sons. There's Moses, the prince of Egypt. There's King David and his many good deeds. There's Joseph with his coat. There's all these big names. But the point of the chapter and the point that Hebrews as a whole letter is making is that those things those people have done are not the thing that makes them a hero or someone to look up to or in any way great. The thing, in fact, that they're actually congratulated for is their faith. They're marked out by their faith in God. So exactly the same thing. I think there are very few of us that would say that Joseph, for example, his meteoric rise, very slow meteor, but his meteoric rise to being in charge of the whole of Egypt, pretty much the most powerful man in the region, from being sold into slavery, that's something that both shows the work of God, but is also an achievement on Joseph's part. He must have been very diligent and persuasive and used his skills. But the achievement is really God's. And his greatest achievement is that he was faithful, that he trusted in God. It's not just faith in God, though. The author argues that by extension, it's their faith in Jesus, even though Jesus wasn't specifically embodied at that time. But it's their faith in the saving nature, the redeeming nature of God, that is what it's all about. In fact, it turns everything towards Jesus in Hebrews, one of the greatest things about it. In part, that is why we called the series Not Enough, which I've never come across a series looking at biblical characters called Not Enough. And it feels counterintuitive. And in fact, Abby, when Abby and I talk about stuff, as you would imagine, before before we kind of go with someone. He said, are you sure about that? It sounds a bit like you're sort of talking down on all of the big names in the Bible. That doesn't sound like a good idea. And she's right, because we don't want to enter into this saying they're not enough, but we are. That's not the position that we're in. But we must remember when we read the Bible that there is only one person who's enough. And however much we might laud characters like David, we remember that David also would be in prison if he were alive today for many, many different things. Because he was not, as a whole, a man who lived a completely moral life, but he had a heart after, his heart was after God's own heart. And he always strove to move back towards God whenever he fell into any sort of sin. Ultimately, we are not enough, and neither are any of the characters. Only Jesus is. And in every circumstance, it's only Jesus who gives us the full and best example of how to live. But we are still looking at these characters because there's still good stuff, especially in their weakness, that we can learn from. And this week, we are looking at the Old Testament character of Sarah, or Sarai. So that is in Genesis. You want to get to chapter 18, we're going to start in. So that's on page 22. We're in the back end of chapter 18. We're going to dot around Sarah's story, but the bit we're going to read now, we're going to read a section in chapter 18 and then in 21. So you just need to flick over the page as we go. And I'll read first, starting at verse 9 in chapter 18. "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he said. Then the Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already old and well advanced in years, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my master is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I did not laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did laugh." And then we're going to flick over to the next page over to chapter 21. So that's on page 25. And we're going to read the first 7 verses of that. So chapter 21, starting at the first verse. "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, 'God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me.' And she added, 'Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age.' And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God." Well, Sarah has an amazing story in the biblical narrative that is all too often overshadowed by the fact that Abraham is normally our term of reference for Sarah. We don't think about Sarah because she's a footnote in most of the stories about Abraham. But that is a mistake that we make. And in fact, it's a mistake that Sarah herself makes when she reads her own story as she's living it. The first passage occurs just after Abraham has received the same promise himself. So Sarah receives this promise, sort of eavesdropping, it sounds like, at the entrance to a tent. to what the men, which for context I'll cover a little bit of this later, but it's a group of three heavenly beings, you could say, who we believe are a theophany. So they are God visiting Abraham. And this is often used as a picture, an image of the Trinity, because there are three of them, and they all seem to interchangeably speak. So it's very difficult to tell which one is being referred to in the Hebrew whenever it says he, or the man, or whatever else. Who knows? But this is God, we should understand, speaking to Abraham and also to Sarah. God has already, in a slightly more private conversation, given this promise to Abraham, and specifically mentioned that Sarah is the one who's going to fulfill this promise. But having instructed Sarah to prepare a meal, he's just sat down with these three men, and Sarah is in this tent nearby. This is totally the norm of the ancient Near Eastern culture of the time. She's not being excluded. Well, I suppose she is being excluded, but not extraordinarily. Abraham's already come to her and said, quick, we've got to get everything ready for these men. They've come to visit. You've got to get the finest flour, bake the best bread, get some food on the table. This is really important. So she is nearby, but not part of the conversation. But by saying to Abraham, where is your wife Sarah? Not only do these men show that though they're strangers, they know not only that Abraham has a wife, but what her name is, and they show that they know she's nearby. They are, in effect, inviting her into the conversation. It doesn't sound like that to us. We think that she's sort of listening in and it's a little bit nefarious, but actually she is kind of being invited to hear what's going on. You know how your ears prick up when you hear your name. Exactly the same thing is occurring. And that's kind of further evidenced by the fact that when she responds in laughter, they hear it and they mention it. They're drawing her into a conversation, even though she and her societal norms and in her own mind has sort of discounted herself from that setting. God says in verse 10 of chapter 18, surely I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And this is a re-giving of a promise that was given in chapter 15, and kind of before that, also in chapter 12. Just the back end of chapter 11 is where we're introduced to Sarah and Abraham, who are known as Sarai and Abram at that point. So let me give you a little bit of a recap of the story so far. You can flick through the pages of the Bible if you want to, but there's no need. I'm not going to dig really deeply into the references that I give you. It's just so that you can anchor them at a point in the story. So in chapter 11, in verses 29 to 30, near the end of that chapter, Sarah is introduced as Sarai, with the unenviable main characteristic and description of barren and childless. So this is Sarai. She's the wife of Abram. She's barren and childless. That is her primary description. Not only is she a footnote to her husband, but the one thing that was her purpose, culturally at the time, she was unable to fulfill. And we should flag then that as we read through the story and Sarai continues to be Abraham's wife, that actually speaks very highly of Abraham, or Abram at this point, because she's not fulfilling what you would be hoping for out of your wife. And culturally at the time, it's not super expected that you stick with something that's not working in such a way. But Abram is consistently referred to as having Sarai as his wife, not someone else. She is constantly mentioned, which means he stands by her despite the fact that she has not fulfilled this part of being a wife. However, it surely must eat her up inside. Not just her own desires to have children, all of that stuff, but feeling like she's not fulfilling her purpose. Now, we don't know at what point they discovered that she was unable to have kids. It Possibly was this point when we're introduced to them, or maybe it was later over time, and it became apparent. But that's what we are told as the character is introduced. Then next in chapter 12, and then later in 15, as I said already, Abraham, or Abraham again still at the time, is promised descendants. In chapter 12, he is promised that his descendants will be many, but in chapter 15, he is promised specifically that he will have a son of his own flesh and blood, and that God is responding in that chapter to a fear expressed by Abraham, that though God has promised that he'll have many descendants, Abraham worries that they will be descendants primarily through one of his servants, that he'll have to give his inheritance to an employee, a member of his household, because he doesn't have any genetic sons to give it to instead. God responds to that by promising, no, when I said that I would make you many in number, I did mean your flesh and blood. Really, so he takes the promise he's given and he puts more flesh on it due to Abraham's lack of faith and worry and fear and doubt. And as we continue through then, in chapter 16, Sarai is about 75 at this point. Abraham's about 85. There's 10 years between them. And she cannot see how this promise that's just been reiterated in chapter 15 could possibly ever come true. How could it be achieved? And here is where Sarai does her great thing for God. Sarai gives her maidservant Hagar to Abraham to try to help realize God's promise for him. But of course, this causes no end of trouble. Hagar's son Ishmael is Abraham's descendant and does receive a promise, an inheritance of his own, but immediately that Hagar is pregnant, it causes a rift in the household. Hagar starts to look with contempt on her mistress, on Sarai. I presume, it doesn't quite go into the detail, but the inference is because, well, I've surpassed you now. I've done what you could never do, and I'm clearly now more important to Abraham than you are. So it causes some division in the household, to the point then also where we're told that Sarai abuses Hagar, is unkind. And not only is it Sarai, but Abraham is complicit in this. So when Sarai comes to him and says, listen, Hagar's saying all this stuff, Abraham says, well, she's your servant, so you deal with it how you'd like to deal with it. There's a moment where both of them are not stepping up to what they should be stepping up to. Sarai is struggling to hold the consequences of her actions, and Abraham is not leading in the way that he has been placed to lead, to encourage redemption in that situation. There's a lot of fallout. I wonder how many of us have ever had a promise from God or given a promise to someone else that we believe is from God, and then we've started taking it off God's hands. So taking it away from him, because it is a big burden for him. He's promised this big thing to the person. Maybe it is children. Maybe it could be something completely different. That job that you thought you would get. Maybe it's about having enough money to make ends meet. And then someone offers you some money with slightly dodgy provenance. You're not sure where it comes from, but it would solve the problem. We take it into our own hands, and we do something that's outside the character of God, that's not consistent with how God would have it done, in order to help him to keep his promise? When has he been faithless? When has he ever failed to come through? And as the story goes on, Sarai, and later known as Sarah, knows that more and more, that God's faithfulness will always stand behind him. In chapter 17, God makes himself unavoidably clear when he visits Abram. First of all, there's the promise to Abram that he will have many descendants. But he worries. He's not sure whether it'll quite work out. God, are you sure that they'll be mine? Because I don't want to have to give all my estate to a servant, as someone who doesn't carry my image, someone who doesn't have my characteristics, who isn't truly my descendant. And God increases the detail and says, no, don't worry, that is the case. I am going to give you a son, a child, to carry on your line. And then that's questioned again. I'm not sure we can do this, thinks Sarai, because I can't have kids, so I'll find someone else to stand in the way. And then in chapter 17 comes the same rebuttal we got in 15, but to the next question, the next doubt that was brought, which is where God says, no, I will bring you descendants that number more than the stars through Sarai. He changes Abram's name to Abraham, father of many, and he changes Sarai's name to Sarah, which actually doesn't really have a change in meaning. They both mean princess. But changing the name signifies a sea change, a real line in the sand, a moment which you can't move back from. Sarah now has received and been given a specific promise, not just to her through Abraham, but specifically to her, that her descendants also would number many. Right in the beginning, God's purpose was to fill Sarah's life with dignity and purpose, and to use her as much as Abraham for his own ends and to glorify himself. But people, largely men, but people in general, because I think it's a problem for all of us, decided to put our own spin on it. Even Sarah herself finds it hard to believe that she could be as significant as she is. But God consistently comes back and says, no, it is you. I do choose you. No, really, you. And that's then where we hit chapter 18. I really enjoy the narrative of laughter. The three visitors come, and the laughter we see to start with in chapter 18 as Sarah responds. I don't know whether she yet knows her name is Sarah, but as she responds to the promise that is given, that not just will she definitely have kids far in the future, but in just a year she will have children. She'll be 90. Now, people lived longer then, so proportionally, maybe not quite as old as 90 seems to us now, but still, even if that was halfway through your life and you lived to 80 or 100, you're still past when people traditionally would be having kids at this time. There's no medical intervention. There's no help. Not only that, but Sarah's never been able to have kids. And so in less than a year, she will have this pleasure. A little note here. I wasn't totally sure if the kids would be in for this bit, so I wasn't sure how I was going to say it. But when Sarah says, am I now to have this pleasure? I can't quite find it. Yes. Will I now have this pleasure? She's not saying, will I now enjoy the gift of children? She's talking about sex. It's a very specifically sensual word, pleasure. That one in Hebrew. She's talking about even now when I'm completely past it and I'm utterly not fulfilling my role as a wife, will I now start having sex again and receive the promise of God? There's a moment here where Sarah does have to do something for God, enabled to work with him to see the promise come to pass. We know, because of Mary and Joseph and Jesus, that God doesn't need sex in order to place a baby inside someone. But what she's being called to is to faithfully make a step towards what God has promised. But it's so laughable to her that she does laugh. This is like a laugh of derision. That's what the word means. It kind of means, it's like saying, "Pah, ugh, whatever, okay, sure." She's completely unbelieving, which is odd because God has kept his promises so far. But she must know that that immediate reflex response isn't quite right because she tries to cover it up. And I love these little exchanges. I wish this is how it worked with my children. Sarah was afraid, and so she lied and said, "I did not laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did laugh." And that's the end of the chapter. It's done. Sarah just accepts it. That's not how it runs with my kids. They keep going on and on until some evidence is presented. But I think she knew. She knew that she'd been seen. And then various stuff happens in the intervening chapters. She hears the promise. She has this moment of laughter. She waits faithfully this time. She doesn't try to take things into her own hands and offer up a proxy. God affirms Abraham and Sarah's marriage. And then in the intervening chapters, something happens, a repeat of something that's already happened, where Abraham persuades Sarah to pretend to be his sister for Abimelech. He's already done this previously with another king, with the Pharaoh, in order to try and keep Abraham safe. It's quite a cowardly approach. Technically, it's true, because Sarah was Abraham's half-sister, but the point is he's trying to deny that Abraham is his wife and deceive Abimelech. Abraham has this idea and persuades Sarah to go along with it. And then later we presume, when we read in chapter 16 there, Sarah has an idea of how to make God's promise come true and persuades Abraham to go along with it with Hagar. Then again we see the same thing happens. Sarah has learned this time, but Abraham persuades Sarah again into making this same deception in order to keep them safe with Abimelech. But it almost backfires. I say this to highlight that it's not just Sarah who tries to take things into her own hands and work out God's promises and work out God's faithfulness for him. Abraham is doing it too. That's why he's trying to do these things like humanly solve the problem rather than take it to God and allow God to protect them. But we get there to chapter 21, to the birth of Isaac, and we see this laughter again. Now, the name Isaac means blessed with laughter or to be a blessing like laughter, but it is akin to the word laughter. It is in itself possibly a little bit of a dig or a little bit of a reminder to Sarah that she laughed at God's ability to follow through on his promises. Not in a cruel way, because God turns that laughter of derision into laughter of joy. But isn't that wonderful how God gives the name Isaac before all of this happens, and yet it happens just to confirm it. So in verse 6 of chapter 21, Sarah says, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." But the laughter has changed. It's now not a derisive whatever. Are you serious laughter? It's a joy-filled laughter. The laughter that you get when you see a child do something, a longed-for child do something that you'd never believed you would be able to see them do. I mean, I don't know that I will ever live to see a 90-year-old new mother. But were I to do that, it would be something that would fill me with laughter as well. When we want to help God fulfill his promises, we must be careful that we don't inadvertently take our faith away from God and instead put it on ourselves or on someone else, just as Sarah did when she presented Hagar. It's a profoundly sad moment in the story because it speaks volumes not only of Sarah's flaws, but also her selflessness in seeking to facilitate God's will above her own well-being and esteem. I think it speaks of her battles with self-esteem and self-worth anyway. I think you can read that, and perhaps if the scriptures were written, yes, by God, but through a woman rather than a man, maybe we would see more of that narrative in here. In a world which in some ways is true today still, but certainly at the time, where having children was the be-all and end-all of a successful life, and certainly a successful wife, it must have been so difficult for Sarah. And it's not uncommon to use your slaves in that setting to further your line. And technically, Ishmael, Hagar's son, as well as Hagar, belonged to Sarah. They were legally hers still, but they didn't feel like it. Her dignity had been taken away. Her esteem had been lessened. She regrets that decision. And who knows how much it was driven deliberately or inadvertently by Abraham, simply perhaps by feeling the pressure, the need to deliver something that seemed impossible. But we should have confidence in who God has called us to be, even where it doesn't seem to match up to the situation that we find ourselves in. We should not sit back and do no work. We need to continue to work to be more of who God has called us to be, but that doesn't mean placing someone else before us in our place. And it sounds dangerously like we shouldn't put others above ourselves. I more mean we shouldn't seek for someone else to do what we've been called to do. Instead of putting our faith in other things rather than in God, we need to steadfastly stick by his promises. We need to trust that, as it says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, he who has called you is faithful, and he will do it. It's a really odd line that appears. It's a single verse that appears in the midst of the letter writer's ending greetings. He says all the things he would normally say, and then says, without context particularly, he who has called you is faithful, and he will do it. And we need to remember that. And Sarah needed to know that. And it took her a few goes, but then she got there. And Isaac gives rise to Jacob, who's also called Israel, who has 12 sons. And they are then the rest of the story of the Bible. And through that, we can step through to Jesus. And in fact, we can trace our own lives back all the way through Jesus to Sarah. Sarah is a hero or a heroine of faith, but she only became a heroine of faith because of her faithlessness. And eventually, she had to rest on God. She wouldn't have known Jesus personally, other than the fact that I think she met him in that trio of men. But she trusts in the same redeeming God that Jesus is and represents. Where is it in your life, in our lives today, that you're trusting on something other than God to fulfill his promise? Where are we writing God out of his own story? I used to dearly love a scripture, Proverbs chapter 16, verse 3, says, "Commit to the Lord all that you do, and your plans will succeed." And I was 17 or 18, and I had a conversation with a friend of mine on the town moor, and we were talking about some plans we had for some great things we were going to do for God. And that was one of our proof texts, was commit to the Lord all that you do, and your plans will succeed. And so we did. We sat down on the moor amidst the cows, and it was a lovely sunny day, and we told God all of the things that we were going to do for him and how he was going to bless them and that they were going to succeed. But of course, I misread that scripture. Committing to the Lord all that you do is not telling him your plans. It doesn't say, tell your plans to the Lord and they will succeed. It says, commit to the Lord all that you do and your plans will succeed. Because when you commit to the Lord all that you do, your plans are his plans, and his plans always succeed. But you've got to do it how he would have you do it. So as we leave this scripture and leave this story, what I want us to remember and learn from Sarah is to trust who God has called us to be. And that firstly might mean we need to find out who God has called us to be. There's some general stuff for everybody, but you may not feel like you've ever been given a direct call by God to do something or be something or go somewhere. So we need to know who we are in God and what he's called us to be. We need to trust that he who has called us is faithful and he will do it. And we need to go about that in God's way, not in our own way, not finding human structures to answer his promises for him.